There were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic, 6 of them survived.
They are unique among the other passengers in the sense that they are the least welcome.
People have always said that 6 of Chinese men were stowaways.
They were kind of shuffled off and hidden, kind of expunged from the records and so on.
Where did they go? How is it possible, they just suddenly disappeared?
So Arthur, welcome to Shanghai Live.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. So the first question would be, what is the driving force behind this film? What inspired the whole team, you yourself, to focus on the stories of the 6 Chinese survivors?
Well, this is my second maritime history film, and the second time I've worked with our lead researcher, Stephen Schrankert, who co-created the project with me. And really, it's his passion that drives the film, and I'm really focused on his passion. So he knew, I think, that there were Chinese passengers, and several of them had survived some years ago. And while we were working on a previous project, Stephen said to me, our next project, we should do this Titanic film with the Chinese survivors. And I said, oh, were there Chinese survivors on Titanic?
You didn't know?
I didn't know, no, I'd never heard of it. So when he said that, I thought, oh, that sounds a little, vaguely interesting. But it was only when I asked amongst friends of mine, both in the UK and in China, that I discovered everyone's reaction was kind of like, what? There were Chinese people on Titanic? How do we not know this story? I mean, I was in China in 1998 when Cameron's movie came out, and it was such a big deal. People were lining up to see it. It was this big romantic story. And when I discovered there were Chinese people in the story, on board Titanic, who had amazing survival stories, I just thought to myself, I wonder how much more people would have been interested in this story back in the late 90s when Cameron's movie came out, if they'd known there was a big Chinese part of the story. I just found it fascinating because of that. It was the people around me that said, that's a film you have to shoot. You have to find out more about those people.
How long did it take to finish this whole documentary?
I think in total it was somewhere between 5 and 6 years. I'm loath to do the maths exactly because I'll probably feel bad about how long it took us. But it's one of those things, you can't rush it. It takes a while to find things out. You've seen the film. I mean, you'll know that we speak to the same people several times. We keep going back and asking them questions. In one of our crucial scenes, an elderly Chinese man, an elderly man in Taishan in the south of China, tells us a poem that he's remembered, 70 years after he heard it and learnt it by heart. I had met that gentleman 3 or 4 or 5 times at that point, and he only remembered it on the last time we were there. So you have to keep being persistent and going back and wondering if there's another way to look at something, another angle to tease out the clues to tell the story.
Okay, so how many places have you been to during this shooting?
Well, because Titanic was sailing from the UK to the US, so we always knew there was probably going to be a UK and a US story. We didn't know at what point the story would bring us back to China. So, and it eventually did bring us back to China for, I think, a remarkable story that most people, certainly within China, are not aware of the importance of this particular place in southern Guangdong province called Taishan, which is so intimately connected to our story. In America, actually, amongst Chinese Americans, Taishan is actually quite famous. It's a famous place because of the number of people who ended up in the US who started their journey in Taishan. So we came back to Taishan. Our base is in Shanghai, right near here. And we spent some time in Beijing. There was another story we worked on in Beijing. And then we ended up going to Canada as well, because one of the men's stories ended up taking him into just near Toronto in Canada. So we ended up there. So I'd say 4 countries and probably about 20, 25 cities we spent time in.
So which part is the most challenging part, do you think? Let's say doing the research or getting in touch with the survivors' descendants or even these researchers?
I think in this story, everything is overlapped. So, doing the research is connected to finding the descendants, because you're not going to find the descendant until you work out what happened to them back in 1912 and where that journey took them. Because you could look anywhere in the world. I mean, how do you know where they ended up? So they're all overlapping problems. Or I guess you could think of it in terms of like a jigsaw. You can't solve this part of the jigsaw until you've solved this part, and then you work across and you find the correct piece to put in place. Fundamentally, the hard thing about this project was that we started everything with two lists. One was a passenger list getting on board Titanic, and the other was a survivors list from a few days later arriving in New York. And on one list we had 8 Chinese names, and on the other we had 6 Chinese names. The spellings were different between the two. Their ages were all different. And even the most fundamental thing, all of the names on the list were 2-character names. And yet, as we know, even in modern China, 3-character names are much more common.
Yeah.
And at that time, in 1912, 3-character names were 90+% of people. So how did they end up being 2 characters? And how do you know who this person is when you don't know what their original name was? So at the heart of this project was the issue of identity. Who is this person? Where did they come from? How and why did they change names? And where did they end up? And what identity did they have when they got there? So there's a process called, I think we would call it deracination, where you get rid of your roots, not deliberately, but you're separated from your past by the politics or the history of a region. And then it's very hard to trace people back. An interesting thing happened to us. Early in the project, we started trying to find genealogists, people who could tell us about family history. And we spoke to some real experts, and these are very, very talented people. They know where to find the records. And we spent a lot of time trying to find the right people. And a number of genealogists in the UK, in Canada, in the US, turned us down on this project. They wouldn't work with us, not because they didn't want to, but they said because Chinese family history, when it's migrant families, immigrant families, is just too difficult to do. It takes too long to do. You know, a German history, you can trace it back to Europe, but a Chinese history is very, very hard because there's these breaks where history kind of divides families up, and it's very difficult to go back. So at the heart of it, the big difficulty was the way that their identities and their names changed over years.
Yeah, let alone you don't know whether these are real names.
Of course, and it turned out that in several cases they weren't real names. Early on, somebody said to us, well, you can forget the ages because they're probably all not true, and half the names won't be true either. So it was like, well, if that's all you have, you know, what else do you use to search for this? The Titanic, there's a sort of Titanic community of interested hobbyists and some professional historians and so on, and they have websites online and bulletin boards and forums, and they share information. And we were told by several prominent members of that community, you know, good luck, but you're not going to find anything because it's 109 years and we've never found anything. We've looked for them, we just didn't find them. And we know that a few people over the years have had a go. They've tried to find the Chinese passengers, find out who they are, and they've never really got any further than just the basic details, the 2 lists, the fact they arrived in New York and left the next day, and that's really all that was known before.
So the researchers and even the whole team, they were working like detectives. They're trying their best to figure out the whole story, the truth, and piece together the whole story to find the clues. It must be a very bumpy journey, right?
It's a very bumpy journey, but I always viewed it as the journey being the important thing. You know, in the end, what we find out is something that's very hard to control. I mean, several people said to me, what if you fail to find one of the people, or you don't find anything? What will you do? And I always said, well, that's the journey. I mean, actually what I'm trying to do is take an audience into the journey of doing the research, and there will be failures. But then there'll be surprising successes, and that will lift you. And that's why, for me, it has the quality of a film and not just a piece of history, because it's got a bumpy road, and I want to take the audience on that bumpy road and see what it feels like. I mean, the truth is, I think Stephen said this to me once, if it was easy, it would have been done before. So the fact that it's difficult is the reason it's taken 109 years to tell their story, because it's only now that there are some of the techniques that we can use to find things out. Like you will remember in the film, we explore the escape routes that they could have taken through Titanic. Well, if we'd done this 10 years ago, all we would have been the maps of the ship and some theoretical information about where certain groups of passengers went, but there was no reference to them. But because about 5 years ago in New York, this incredible team started working on a wonderful game called Titanic Honor and Glory. They had created a 3D rendering inside Titanic where we can literally walk up and down all the corridors and work out the most likely route. not based on level by level blueprints, but actually by walking down the corridor and seeing how it fits together and works in a very visceral, real way. And some of these techniques were not available in past years. So we were, in a sense, we were lucky. The timing was pretty good for us.
Okay, so let's talk about some details in this film. Is it okay?
Sure, yeah.
The details in the film.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because when I saw, the son of Fang Lang, he had a couple of seconds of silence. Because he was told the stories not directly from his father, but from some friends of his father or some relatives of him. So I thought that was really upset, or let's say confused or disappointed for him.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think when we started this film, it was a story about a piece of metal called Titanic, and then some men that we didn't know, and how did they escape? Because they had a very high survival rate. So it started out in that way, but the more we pursued this investigation, the more that I realized that the part of the story that was most profound and most moving was the fact that Titanic and the history around Titanic and what was happening at that time has continued to shape and mold families that are still around now. So in the case of the man we call Fang Rongshan, who is believed to be Fang Lang from the ship, his son, Tom Fang, had spent a few years wondering if he was connected to this story, not really knowing. And when we met him, we felt that he was convinced himself that he was properly Fang Lang's son, that his father really was.
But he was not 100% sure.
But he wasn't 100% sure, and neither were we. And I think that's fair. That's the way you should start this kind of journey. And it took us about 3 years to work through the evidence that we came across and the stories that other people were able to tell us, to get enough details in place that we could make a decision about whether he was or he wasn't. We could take him through that journey. But right at the heart of that journey, and what I found so moving, is that history, and something that we view as being an event from 100 years ago, of great symbolic value, but not necessarily any impact really on our lives now, turned out to still be having an effect on people's lives. That the breaks in families, the secrets and sometimes lies they had to tell just to survive in the world they were in, where they had to live with secrecy, where they had to keep things hidden away to protect their families, they felt, because of the complicated immigration situation then. That those lies and secrets, often for the best of reasons, were kept. And yet they have a profound effect on families now, which for me is a very, very moving thing. That something that's an ancient piece of history could still be affecting a family now. And the journey we went on with Tom, I think, I don't think he's ever said this out loud, but in some ways I felt like it was us trying to help Tom get closer to a father that he'd already lost. That in some ways we were helping him to reach out. I don't know if that's how Tom feels, but I feel I see it in his face. And I feel that's the journey we went on with him, to bring him closer to that and allow him some peace. To say, I understand my father now. I know in some senses why he didn't tell us that story. He wasn't a bad man hiding a dark secret. He was somebody who was trying to protect us and had complicated feelings about a piece of history that really pulled those generations apart and made it very difficult for them to live fully open lives.
He's feeling quite relieved, right?
I think when we were able to bring Tom, and I think you'll know the scene I'm talking about, when we were able to bring Tom to meet other survivors' families and have them kind of accept each other, it's a profound moment. It's certainly a profound moment for me to see them together and to see the doubt kind of gone. And Tom is able to I hope, embrace that story and say, this is part of my family. And those few moments when my father was pulled from the water and rescued are the reason why my family is here now. And I think for me that was in the end the deepest reason for pursuing the story and taking it right to the end. I mean, if anything, that's what it means to me. It's about families that are still around now.
And did any of their descendants or the researchers see anything that impressed you a lot until today even?
I think the researchers are incredible. I mean, we had the most incredible group of people who, through thick and thin, went to archives and libraries and dug through family collections of photographs and went to museums and used their connections, and they just were wonderful. I mean, they did so much work to find out what we found out, that I'm deeply grateful to the team that put this together. As for the descendants, I think this story has so many different rich meanings for them. We were able to find some relatives of survivors who just didn't really even know the story at all, or just had some sense of a story, didn't know that they were related to it. And it's just nice to be able to have them be part of that story. If you think of all of the other survivors of Titanic, there were more than 700 survivors. If you, locally around the world, if you go and visit the city or village they're from, you will usually find some kind of a plaque or a memorial that remembers that person. They're significant. It's part of a national story we tell ourselves. This is part of my country's history, or this is who we are. It's one of those stories that has been loaded up with a lot of cultural baggage and historical baggage. I think it's great that we can claim this story for China now and say that China has a Titanic story, and it's a particular set of people from mostly one area, and that area can be proud of that history and use that history and that connection to Titanic to tell a story about themselves and how they went out into the world, or went out and explored and came back, or went to another country and tried to make a fortune and send it back to their family. I think it's important on that level. I'd love in 10 years' time that people would walk through a village somewhere in the south of China and say, oh, this is the village where the guys from Titanic, they came from here.
Yeah, but actually, these Chinese survivors, they were never mentioned before in history books or any like reports. So actually, what happened at that time?
They were not mentioned, well, they were only mentioned in two places. They were mentioned on the passenger lists that we had, so they're on the list, you can see the name. Really, the only other way that their story was touched on was in the days after the accident, and even starting before they arrived in New York on the rescue ship Carpathia. There were stories that appeared in the media, mostly in the US and the UK, that made claims about the Chinese men as if they had done something that was somehow immoral or dishonorable. And the claims started with things like saying, and this is, remember, before they'd even arrived in America, so I don't know where the story came from, but they would say things like they were stowaways on Titanic.
Even before
they arrived, there were stories saying, oh, there were some Chinese men on board and they didn't even have a ticket for Titanic. Well, that's not true. They had a ticket. We know the ticket number.
Oh, it was like some people like saying, I saw something, right?
Yeah, I think, or maybe what happened is some people had seen a list and seen the names and said, well, they shouldn't be on board. Or so. I don't know where these things start. So there were already rumors they didn't have tickets. And then later the rumors kind of changed and morphed, and it became the claims that they had either dressed as women to get into a lifeboat, the famous women and children first, that somehow they'd been thinking, oh, women and children first, we will dress as women, we'll get into a lifeboat and escape. Or that somehow they had hidden inside a lifeboat. And in using that technique, they'd managed to get out on a lifeboat without anybody noticing they were there. So we began to look at these claims. Some people said to us, that's probably what they did, so you might not want to touch this story because maybe you'll find out bad things about them. I always said if we find out bad things about them, we'll say them. I think it's just the honest thing to do. And also I thought, if there was maybe one guy did something not so good, it doesn't mean the other five, we should tar them all with the same brush. I mean, if there was one English guy on board did something bad, I don't think that says something bad about all of English people or something. That's just one person. Anyway, we looked at it, I hope, in an objective way. And we began to look at the claims, and the more we looked at them, the more we realized that there was almost no evidence, that most of it was hearsay, that it was passed on from someone else. And B, when we looked at who was telling the story, it began to be clear that most of the stories about, especially men on board who had done something villainous or done something dishonorable, most of those stories were aimed, strangely, at people that weren't American and British, at people on board who were, at that time by definition, kind of foreigners. They were Italians, or they were Eastern Europeans, or they were from Middle Eastern countries, or in the case of the most obviously foreign people on board, visually the people that you would point out, it was the Chinese guys, or the one Japanese guy who was on board. And so you begin to see a pattern where it's almost like survivors are telling a story in which some bad things happened, but it wasn't their group doing them, it was another group doing them. I think in some ways we ought to be outraged by it, but we also ought to be sympathetic. I think a very naive time in history when people had a lot of built-in prejudices and maybe had lost a husband or something, and they survived on a lifeboat, and then their husband didn't get on, but they can see 3 other men in the lifeboat. And so I can imagine, we can sympathize with that. I think something that Stephen, our lead researcher, Stephen Schwankert, always says is, we can sympathize with that, but we don't have to follow that thinking. We don't have to believe the same thing that people believed 100 years ago. We can look at it with fresh eyes. And I think it's deeply, deeply unfair to blame people for wanting to survive. And it's important behind all of this, there's no evidence they dressed as men and women. We built a lifeboat, a life-size lifeboat, to look at the ways that they could possibly have hidden, if that's true. The evidence suggests that none of that is true. And I think we need to remember at the end of the day that most, if not all, of the lifeboats on board Titanic left with empty seats. Now, if anybody was sneaking onto a lifeboat, but there were empty seats, that means there was room to put other people on. There is almost no evidence that any women or children didn't get onto a lifeboat because a man took their seat. Most women and children that died on Titanic were not on the decks, the boat decks, in time to get on board. Many of them third class were still inside the ship. Those who stepped into a lifeboat just before it was launched to survive, to do their best to survive, were not doing anything wrong. It was their right to try to survive. And they weren't fighting to get in there, they were stepping into lifeboats. And I think it's really important to vindicate them. It's like a court case, you know, if you don't have the evidence, then you need to vindicate them and say, there is no reason to believe they did anything wrong. They survived. And in fact, in one case, in the case of the man we call Fang Lang, there is evidence that once he was rescued from the water, he didn't take a lifeboat place, he was pulled from the water. When he was rescued and pulled into the lifeboat, he took over rowing the boat and helped them to get to the Carpathia, the rescue ship. So, if anything, the picture is really the opposite picture than the one we've been described for all these years.
Some deleted clips from James Cameron's film Titanic will be released on the big screen for the very first time this time. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, somewhere in the early days of the project, someone told us that there was a deleted scene that featured one of the Chinese men. It turns out to be the man that we now call Fang Lang. It was a dramatic scene of him being rescued from the water, floating on a wooden board, and then being pulled into what in the scene you can see is lifeboat 14. So we knew that this scene existed, and we spent some time, we found it, we watched the scene, and we realized that almost nobody knew about this scene. It had been released at some point in the past on one of the versions of the DVD, but I think it was largely unnoticed. People hadn't noticed that it was there, but it was one of about 20 or so deleted scenes. And it was because of that scene, I think, that we began to wonder, was it possible that we could ask James Cameron some questions about how he knew about the story so early, and you know how he'd created that scene, and why in the end it had got deleted from the film. I mean, to be fair to James Cameron, he's a deeply he's a man who is deeply interested in the Titanic story, and the fact that he even knew about the story in the mid-1990s when they were filming Titanic is kind of incredible, because nobody really ever referred to that story at that point. So he filmed this scene, he did it very well, in an interesting way, and it ended up being cut, you know, largely I think because of pacing and story reasons. And one of the interesting things that I had a chance to ask Cameron was, and I'd always suspected this, was had that scene of the man we call Fang Lang floating on a piece of wood actually inspired the very similar scene of Jack and Rose in their final scene together.
Finale scene.
The finale scene of them on Rose on the board, and Jack is in the water, and I'd always thought, well, I wonder where he got the idea for that story, because it turns out actually not many people on Titanic did float on pieces of board. Most people were in the water, and very few people were rescued. Only 4 or 5 people were rescued in the water, and one of them was Fang Lang. So when I finally got a chance to ask him about that scene, he confirmed that, in fact, Jack and Rose's final scene in the film is inspired by the Fang Lang scene.
Okay. And why did the team decide to, finally bring it to the big screen, to the cinema, instead of just putting it online? Because we know sometimes online screening can reach more potential audiences, of course.
From fairly early on in this project, I viewed this as a very story-driven documentary. I mean, my intention was not to make a very kind of dry historical film with a voiceover narration that tells you exactly what facts we know about this. I wanted it to be an exploratory film, a film that feels a bit like a detective story. And so it always felt like it had a kind of size and scope and heft that made it an emotional journey. And I think films with an emotional heart often suit being on the big screen. Once we had a distributor on board, and we found a great Chinese distributor, theatrical distributor, I knew that's the direction we were going, and I wanted to bring it to the big screen, and I was excited to bring the camera and deleted scene to the big screen for the first time, and to present Taishan in a way where we could shoot big aerials of the beautiful landscape in that part of China. And I wanted to bring on board a film composer and have music that felt big and would fill a space. And I also just always, I think I imagined that I wanted an audience to sit together in a dark space and feel other people watching it together, that it was an experience that somehow was a community experience and not just, oh, you know, what's online tonight or what can I find here. So it felt like that was the right way to tell the story here and to bring it out to the cinema. Also, it's just a very exciting way to present a documentary. But it will be online eventually. You know, we'll take it online, and TV stations will play it as it rolls out across China and into the world. What I'm hoping is that over time, there may be more survivors' families come forward. I've got to, you know, tell you a little secret, but we do know of some more families who are linked to this story, and they were not ready yet to tell the story of their families and their connection to Titanic. But I'm hopeful that people will see that our intentions are good, and we're trying to explore this story in a kind of objective way, and we want to encourage anyone who thinks they might have a connection to the Titanic story to come forward, because we'd love to follow up on this story as well at some point and bring more of the tales of the survivors, or those that passed away on board, you know, to a much bigger audience.
Do you have any other plans for overseas screening?
Absolutely. We're rolling out, I think already we have an international distributor, and they're beginning to roll out in other countries. So all of the information about our release dates in China and around the world and other screenings will be on the website, the6documentary.com.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you for your time. Though their stories have never been mentioned before, but they will never be forgotten thanks to the Six. Thank you for your time once again.
Thank you.